Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Sacred and Profane Love. This is a bonus episode that I am recording on the Hillsdale College, Washington, D.C. campus. Do I have that right? Mm-hmm. And I am very pleased to be joined by Dr. Matthew Mehan, who is an assistant professor of government here at Hillsdale. Welcome to the podcast,
Thanks
Matt.
very much.
So I want to talk about two books that you've written this morning. The first is Mr. Mehan's mildly amusing Mythical Mammals. The second is The Handsome Little Cygnet, which is written by Matthew Mehan and illustrated by John Foley. Before we get to your book, I want to talk about a tweet of mine. Let's start there. I don't know if I woke up on the wrong side of the bed or what, and I don't remember what triggered this tweet, but it was like a hate tweet against the Harry Potter adult fandom phenomenon. And the tweet was just like, look, if you're a grown-up and like your favorite book is Harry Potter, I've got a problem with that.
Read another book.
Yeah. Or if you're an adult and you're so obsessed with J.K. Rowling, because you're this Harry Potter superfan, like, we need to talk. And the amount of vitriol and hate I got for this tweet was, I obviously, it's just a lack of foresight on my part. Anyway, it was ridiculous. But then amidst all the hate were some interesting claims. So people were saying things like, no, it's actually fine for adults to enjoy and read children's literature. If children's literature is good literature, then it will be equally suitable as literature for adults or children. And then a lot of people were citing C.S. Lewis. They're like, look, I read the Chronicles of Narnia. They're great. I'm an adult, blah, blah, blah. To which my response was, and this is what I want to talk about, whether or not I'm correct or what. My response was, well, yes, of course you can enjoy children's literature as an adult with children. Like, you should be reading children's literature with children, and you should enjoy reading with children. It's wonderful. But, like, my complaint isn't about that group of people, right? So this is just a segue into asking a general question, which I think is worth talking about. And that is, how ought we to think about children's literature as opposed to normal literature, and how adults should approach children's literature?
Yeah, no, that's great. I imagine Muggle was probably the kindest thing you were called in the hate mob on Twitter.
Yeah, a lot of people told me to die.
Yeah, oh, nice. That's a different Latin excrucio or whatever, different spell names.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally share your general sort of Potterdom, like, come on, people. I was doing a talk at Capital One once about rhetoric for their middle management, just totally random, never did it again, never did it before. Uh-huh. And I just was walking to the hall to talk, and I see this boardroom that's the Hogwarts Consortium boardroom. I'm like, come on.
Yeah,
read another book, you guys.
Yeah, it's weird.
But anyway, so I like to call my books, although more so Mehan's Mammals or M5, I like to call them family books. Uh-huh. Because I try to write for the upper register for the adults so that they're not bored to tears by something saccharine and pointless.
Yeah, like Pete the Cat.
Yeah, exactly.
It's pretty bad.
It's pretty bad. But even like ones that are really beautiful and lovely are still like, they don't put an upper register in sometimes. And while you're like, that's a good book for kids, it's just for kids. And you're like, it just bores you to tears. Even though you can kind of admire what it's done. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm with you that the reason why you do that is so that families read good books together. Mm-hmm. But hopefully, look, if you have the leisure of your kids are grown, or you don't have kids yet, or you don't have kids for whatever reason, why don't you read some Conrad, some Dostoevsky, some Tolstoy, some Shakespeare, like go up a register. So I do think that's a bit of an infantilist argument to say, yeah, I just get to read those over and over. If you're in education, then you should be reading them over and over again, right, as a teacher, so that you can make reference to them and know them and discuss them with students. So I think in my life as a teacher, it's been very normal to see a bunch of adults rereading juvenile fiction. Mm-hmm. But hopefully there's an adult world that's pushing to the high end.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there obviously is a difference between children's literature and just literature without qualification.
I do think that there is a certain kind of humorous, sort of strangely playful catacomb kind of situation going on in the arts where people are doing things that aren't normally done in kids lit because the literary sort of superstructure or superculture doesn't like certain things to get out and famous and be known. And so people will sort of hide and snooker in little important things that they want to do with literary arts. I feel that way about my work in one sense, is certain things that you wouldn't even really be allowed to do in the sort of current milieu, except in a subculture. The subcultures aren't destroyed. It's a free country. But the sort of wider, get to a wider audience, like you can't do it. It's not permissible.
Right.
The critics and judges won't let you. So I think there is something about kidlit now that's weird in that people are sometimes exploding the genre in strange ways because they're frustrated about the current sort of situation in adult lit.
Yeah, well, and then there's this new thing, YA, young adult, right? Yeah, I don't touch it. But I also know a lot of grown-ups, and I don't mean, I mean like colleagues of mine in the university environment who obviously they have their scholarly research, but when we're talking about their leisure reading, it's like YA stuff. And I'm like, it doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
You know?
I know the line, get them reading books, then get them reading good books, right? Isn't that Sam Johnson, I think?
Yeah, I'm completely against this.
Yeah, it's a little, there's a truth in it in one sense, because they can't read the highest things first. But the idea that you would give them garbage first is silly.
Right.
It's just, I think what he meant was not the heights of culture, but the idea that you would sort of, I mean, he who is without sin cast the first stone. Like, I have a sort of, like, I talk about, like, my favorite, this is the best bad movie, and I love it. Like, there's a terrible movie, Pacific Rim. It's just awful.
I haven't seen it.
It's cheesy. It's absurdist. But I watched it, and I'm like, okay, that is absolute garbage, cotton candy, popcorn, like, the ballpark Frank, like, just bad food. But I really enjoyed it. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
So I get that there's that in fiction where you can just sort of enjoy something that's not that great.
Well, what is your junk food fiction?
So I frankly have tried to, given that I'm a PhD in literature, I've tried to sort of go on a diet, right? And
Okay,
eat
you're
healthy.
like a vegan when it comes to.
But if I were to go back and regress, it would be like I could read a Tom Clancy novel in like 2 seconds and like kind of enjoy some of that old Cold War goofballery or Benchley's Beast, like something like that.
Yeah. So I'll just make a confession. I actually really enjoyed Dan Brown's novels. Like, they're completely, like, if you just bracket the just absolutely
Absolute
absurd.
insanity, yeah.
Because I read them, because my mother-in-law was reading them. And then she was saying all this crazy stuff about, like, Opus Dei. And I'm like, wait, what? And so then I was like, okay, I'm going to read this, because she was, like, really into it and not really understanding maybe the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And, yeah, it just had this, I read it in like, I don't know, 3 hours. It just was really fast paced.
It's Gnostic cotton candy.
And I'm like, yeah, where's the, anyway, it's obviously a terrible novel, but I did enjoy it.
Someone once said, I don't want to talk about the themes of this book. I just want to talk about its grammar. And it was just like 10 sentence dissections. And it was the most humiliating thing. You're like, this book is not well written.
Yeah.
But it's, I get it. It's Gnostic cotton candy.
Right. So your background's in literature. And was there a particular genre that you were studying or historical period?
Yeah, I definitely focused on the early modern Renaissance.
Okay.
Chaucer, Moore, Shakespeare were major sort of focus, texts, focused authors. I spent a lot of time on the Aeneid back in the day.
Oh, wow.
Translated the first 6 books myself and read it a bunch of times. I taught it for 10 years.
Fantastic.
And then
Did you teach it in Latin?
No, well, sort of. but it was not a Latin course. But I made a lot of. They had Latin, so I could go there.
Yeah.
On a lot.
Yeah.
But I was not a classics.
Right.
It was a English lit class in translation.
Yeah.
So I have some eclectic, things that I like. Like I still teach now every semester, twice a year, a continental lit course. So we do Crime and Punishment. I teach twice a year, and I love that
that's
book.
such a fun book.
Oh, yeah. It's
Talk about a quick read.
One of my professor friends calls it the Cadillac of seminar class, right? It's just like the great classic car,
Yeah.
And I teach Utopia 3 times a year, Morse Utopia. I teach Hamlet 3 times a year, sometimes 4 times a year. Because there's, Hillsdale's got a lot of required core courses, and I teach some of those. So there's a lot of texts I get close to. Some I don't like as much, but really respect for their craft, not necessarily for their teachings or their view of things. Like Baudelaire, I've come to have a profound respect for his power over modern culture.
Oh, I love him.
Yeah,
but
I do too. He's amazing.
He just writes about original sin.
Yeah, and
And the need for grace. He does. Wait,
Yes.
that would be a different episode.
Yeah, that's right, different episode.
Just trust me.
Yeah, no, I'll buy it. I would just say, but does he hug the teaching?
Well, Yeah. So why did you want to write children's books? Were you frustrated with the books available to your kids, or was it just sort of something you always wanted to do?
So it started in a weird way. I was actually very moved by Thomas More's example that when he was a young man, he decided he was just he said, look, if I actually want to be of service, being of service means that I need to be a master communicator. Like I just need to be able to knit people together in speech. Like that's a fundamental part of civic service is the rhetoric, right? And the speech. And part of that is clearly poetry. Right. And sort of the cultural arts that bond a people together in love and wisdom and directing towards high things, right? Through that communication, through the eye, but through the ear. And he just started practicing different kinds of literary arts. Now, I'm no Thomas More, so I didn't get far, but I did poetry because that's something I sort of knew. And I was like, I just want to practice this and get good at it. And as I started doing that, projects started to kind of take shape, right? You just sort of, you're fiddling with the Play-Doh and then you start to see a shape and you're like, oh, this could be this. And it sort of fell out as just kind of an imitatio of someone I admired and respected and wanted to be helpful. And then, you read all these great poets who have these huge burning hearts that want to help everybody by bringing them beauty and truth and goodness. Then you kind of just want to do some of that too. And again, like a children's poet, no better do him call. I didn't feel like I was a master. So I didn't swing for the fences. I swung for a single, maybe stretch it into a double and try to do some beautiful things in children's literature. But that's kind of how it started, frankly, fairly organically by just kind of getting close to more and then getting deeper into my master's in English and then deeper into my PhD. And it took shape. Mehan's Mammals, I tried to model it after a medieval bestiary.
Right. I love that.
Yeah, but also episodically in a kind of imitation of the Book of Proverbs, where it doesn't look like it's ordered. It's just kind of like one thing after another. But in fact, if you sit with it long enough, right, and you don't have to sit with it long, it still will shape you in ways just by being around it for a little bit. But you start to see what's happening in chapters 7 through 10 of the Proverbs. Like, oh, there's an order here. You're being led somewhere in these funny happenstance ways. It's I wanted to do that kind of work because I really admired for whatever reason, I just stumbled into studying epigrams. Again, through Thomas More, who wrote 260 plus epigrams as a preface to the Utopia. And I did some work on that in grad school. And so I really liked that kind of epigrammatic episode, but sort of a hidden pattern that was designed to help somebody, but it wasn't here is number 1, number 2, number 3. I really like that. So.
Yeah. So let's talk about Mr. Mehan's mildly amusing mythical mammals.
They told me not to do that, by the way.
Oh, really?
Don't. Their title's too long. People will hate it.
Oh.
My publisher said I cannot talk about the old book.
Yeah, I was like,
no.
oh.
No, not at all.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Mr. Mehan's mildly amusing mythical mammals, which I think is a delightful title.
Thank you.
Although, I'm not a I'm not a publisher.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just curious, one, how you got connected to the illustrator, because, the illustrations are really striking and beautiful and sometimes absurd and funny. And then I guess I just want to hear about the process of this book taking shape and coming to be, and also your experience of reading it with kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. First things first, John Foley, who's a very good friend of mine, he and his wife were very good friends, my wife Molly and I. He and I taught together for years at the Heights School here in Potomac.
Oh, you taught at the Heights?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we'd sit at lunch chatting about culture and the revivification of it. And, yes, to the point you asked earlier, I didn't even get to it. But, a lot of what I saw was sort of like subpar grade B kid stuff, or you had to reach back to sepia classics.
Right. I mean, I mostly read classics to my kids.
But part of me was like, that is the symbol of a dying culture. It feels like you're eating out of a can of beans, dodging Terminator 2 robots in a bombed out, farmhouse. If you can only use old books and no one's producing something beautiful that has the sort of classic feels, I'm going to do some of that. I want to do that just almost as a declaration of renewed health, right? Cross that threshold of hope. Let's have some more of our own times, good times.
Right.
And we were talking about that, cultural rejuvenation and hope and the idea of doing a kid's book together, him as illustrator, myself as author, it sort of took shape over lunch. But we were very perfectionists in our way, we're sort of intense. So we spent a year doing political cartoons that we didn't really publish. A couple of them went into some papers. One went into a Senate briefing to try to convince some people to not do something. I heard it scared some people because the image was rather frightening. But we just decided we were going to practice putting word and image together. And it actually was so salutary because it's not easy getting someone else to see what you think. It's actually kind of like the art of friendship right there. And it was actually a forge for these books. We spent a year doing it, and our wives were like, please, this isn't making any money, and it's actually a lot of time. You need to stop. And we're like, no, it's going to be for something good, we promise. And then we did the book the year after. And so we have a Google Doc of 115 pages that describe each image and workshop it. We even choose music to set the mood of the soul of this illustration.
Wow.
We break up the different parts and find analogs. And most of the paintings are actually, they're either making references to different natural things that have themes that tie into the poems, and usually they're also referencing pieces of ancient art or from the artistic tradition that also have resonant themes with the poems. So we kind of just did here is a tour of human history through these images and poems that are referencing and adapting from different authors and painters. So we went nuts.
I think the product is really wonderful. And reading this book too, I have 6 kids, but
wonderful.
I mostly read this with my son Dominic, who is 6, and he was very drawn to the illustrations, right, which is good.
Right.
Another complaint I have about children's literature now is that it's just that a lot of the illustrations are terrible.
Deliberately so, sometimes, it seems.
And it's just what's going on there. One thing that I really appreciate is just how marvelous the illustrations are, because it really is important for younger kids to have something to help in their imagination.
John's a realist impressionist, trained in the Boston School, from masters trained in the École des Beaux-Arts. They can trace their master apprenticeship all the way back to Raphael's workshop in Florence.
Oh, wow.
So he's the real deal.
Yeah. So, but I also think for this book, it's the necessary complement because, on the one hand, this is obviously a children's book, but on the other hand, it's kind of not, right?
I mentioned that earlier, a little bit of genre explosion.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I mean, I think it works. In my experience with my son, it works.
Yeah,
but
good to hear from you. Thank you.
Yeah. So, but again, I would invite you at some point to talk about your experience of reading this with children and their response. But there are a lot of big words, right? Unfamiliar to children's ears. So what I'm just
even some adults.
Well, for sure.
Yeah.
I went to the glossary. Like,
Absolutely.
what's that?
That's why a third of the book is a glossary.
Yeah. So I just want to hear your thought process about that.
Yeah. So I wanted this book. This sounds really wacky, but I don't care. You're totally up for wacky, I can tell, which is great.
Yeah.
So I honestly, I knew what I was doing in that, okay, this book is my first book. I want it to be almost like, like in ice skating, there's the technical portion where they're doing all these very discrete moves that are very complicated. And then they go out and do sort of more simple, in a certain sense, big jumps and more razzle dazzle. I actually wanted my first book to be very technical and complex. And so I worked very hard to kind of make it sumptuously complicated in this way. But part of what I wanted to do with the vocabulary, so on a couple different levels, one, and I've had a number of conversations over the years about the book where people are like, that's a lot of big words. This might be a problem for kids. I'm like, yeah, but you know what? Right before I wrote it, I actually read The Wind in the Willows to my kids. We bumped into tons of words that nobody knew, and there was no glossary. But you just kind of let it roll because the beauty and the fun and the illustrations and, I don't know what a mirror is, but I'm going to just push past, right? And there's even passages that have tons of natural vocabulary words that nobody knows today unless you go look them up.
Well, and also whenever you're reading classical kids literature, it's just stuff that doesn't exist anymore.
That's right, yes.
You're like, what's
Spindles
that?
and,
I don't know. Yeah,
right. But what is that? Part of me was just kind of okay, I hear you, and the critics were going to crush me if I did this. Because everyone's very much reading appropriate, age appropriate. It has to have the words that are for that grade. It's okay, I'm ignoring that, but I'm going to answer you because I'm going to make a huge glossary so that no kid feels dumb or left out. They can quickly just go read a simpler definitional version and go, got it. Okay, that's what that word is. And part of me was okay, when are you going to build vocabulary better than with rhyme, rhythm, humor, art, pictures, little beasts and fables? Right, this is the time to build their vocabulary when it's so packed full of other sugar, right? Rather than just stare at a vocabulary list, which hasn't gone very well for us, frankly, over the last 25, 30 years.
Oh my gosh.
So I was this is the time to do it when I'm we're drenched in good, beautiful art and fun in this book. Let's push some words. Now, that's for the kids. For the adults, the words I use are symbolically important in many cases. And the glossary, and this is for high-end nerd fun if you want to play. I love Edmund Spencer's Shepherd's Calendar, even if I don't like everything Edmund Spencer thinks. He's a brilliant and beautiful poet. In his Shepherd's Calendar, which I spent a lot of time studying in grad school and loved, he has footnotes with all these commentary in the back of each of the poems for each month. And they're actually this funny sort of decoder ring to think more deeply about the themes of each of his months. The poem of each month. So I actually use the glossary as a kind of way to hint at and point at different deeper themes that are involved in both the paintings and the poems in each of the letters of the alphabet as a kind of nod to or rip-off of Edmund Spencer. But so, if you want to go full deep nerdery, the book has a much deeper level to think about things like death, time, love, friendship, God, the fallen will, right? There's lots going on. And the glossary signals it by having words that people might not know. And then they go, oh, I got to look that up. But then they're in the middle of this discussion between, Noah Webster, Sam Johnson, and Matt Mehan, about the history of this word and different poems and things. But they'll get a straight definition too. But so I wanted to do both of those things, and it's indicative of the work where I'm trying to go. But I think that's what poets do. Oftentimes is teach you how to do two things at once. Right. When you're talking to one child, you're being listened to by four others. And so you're having two conversations at once. And that's an adept parent who can do two things at once. Right.
Did you have in your mind when you were writing this, did you have a target age? I mean, I know you said you write for the family, but did you kind of feel oh, this is the sweet spot?
Yeah, the middle schooler, basically. Okay. The kid who in a summer, right, would go on a vacation and not quite be able to do all the older kid things, but not be a baby and want to play the baby games.
So like a
And
sixth grader?
Seventh grader might grab a book and go disappear and just devour an entire book and kind of get lost in it.
Right.
That age for me was like around like 5th, 6th, 7th grade.
My 6-year-old really loved it.
Yeah, but I tried, like that was the core, but then I tried to like lengthen out the tails on each end to reach down. That's why you start with an actual just letter block that has the funny alliterative games.
Yeah.
Right, like the...
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's really great about this, just for our listeners who, aren't looking at it, it's, how many pages is this? Maybe I should not count the glossary when okay, so it's like 81 pages. I mean, the thing is, you can read like 5 or 6 pages, and that's it. That's your bedtime reading. Right. And there are a lot of nights when that's all I have time for anyway.
Exactly.
And
we have a big family too, so it's very much with that in mind.
Yeah. So it's really wonderful. And what I found was Dominic would come back to me with a book and be like, we're on H, Mom, now. Yeah. Because frankly, when I first got the book, I thought, wow, this is, what's the word? Sophisticated.
Elaborate.
Sophisticated. Right?
Yeah.
And then I had planned to read it to Dominic because he just, of all my kids, he loves reading with Mom more than anyone. And then I thought, oh, maybe it won't work. But it did. It really did. Who have you read the book with besides your own kids?
With nieces and nephews. I've done a number of readings for schools, and I've done them for as young as 1st and 2nd grade.
Yeah.
And as old as 7th. After that, I think they're kind of like, please, just get away from me. This is weird.
Right.
But yeah, so I've done a number of readings. I was on tour for like probably 6 months going to schools and things.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. I might not be able to sustain that level of energy for round 2.
Right. Well,
we learned that might not be the best for our mental health. But it was a tough road. But I did get to read a lot, and that was the response I got, was sort of like wonder and curiosity and enjoyment, but not understanding the first time. Where they're just kind of like, whoa, that's cool, and I like this one, but but then you get fan mail and people like asking you questions and drawing pictures that show that they sort of understood what was at stake. And,
well, I mean, that's still my experience with most poetry. The first time I read it, it's like, oh, that was beautiful and wonderful, but I'm not really sure I know what
was happening. Yeah.
Not even maybe 70% sure what this poem is about. That's why poetry is so great. You keep going back to it and you see something every time that you didn't see there before. I guess just really fast, I wanted to invite you to read maybe one of the shorter ones, just so that our listeners get a sense for the poetry. You can pick whichever one you want. Well, doesn't matter.
I'll pick the shortest, simplest, and it was actually one of the first ones written that the rest was built around.
Yeah, great.
The main character, Dali, who's the guy on the cover.
Yeah,
who has a little bit of he goes on a journey. There is a plot it's loose and light, but he's good at dodging the rain, and he gets sort of, the rain is a symbol of sadness, and he gets rained on and has to sort of learn to cheer up and to learn how to kind of govern his heart away from sadness, which, was kind of a triumph for all of us. So this is just the very simple introductory poem for the Dali, the letter D creature, who's sort of like a dog combined with a gibbon monkey with necktie ears. The Dali. Among the pelting drops of rain, the Dali can be seen again. The rocks, the trees, they know him well, but where he'll show no one can tell. For though the forests soaked and sopped, the Dali skirts each drop that's plopped. So if you are one keen of eye who sits and stoops in storms, you'll spy the dodgy Dali dancing dry.
I love it. Do you have any plans for an audiobook?
So, yes.
Because it would be brilliant.
We were hoping to do one. My thought is actually to do an audiobook of the 2 books together.
Yeah.
Would be kind of a fun way to do it. But yeah, it's been mentioned. It was just frankly... a
lot of writers,
time and energy.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be wonderful because unlike many writers, you have a great voice, like spoken voice.
Yeah.
So
I think actually like just in the last few years as I've gotten like older and more like gravelly tired.
Yeah.
That I've gotten that.
Yeah.
But
it's time to do the audiobook
right.
then. So let's talk about, one more question before
Please.
we move on to your next book.
Yeah.
Because this is a question that just really interests me as a parent, but just generally. How do you think we get children to appreciate poetry? Because I don't think the schools are doing a great job with that. The way that poetry seems to be taught now is really analytical and in a way that seems to basically just turn kids off from poetry. Like, we're going to learn the different types of poems and blah, 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 rather than just appreciating the beauty of it, which I think is, step one, if not also step 2 and 3. But how do you think we can help our children to come to love and appreciate poetry?
So that's a great question. And I've thought a lot about it and actually like made some moves. Like we did, things at our school, the Heights, that I taught at for 20 years before I was part-time Heights in Hillsdale and then full-time Hillsdale, sort of moved over the last few years. But at the Heights, we have poetic recitation competitions, like the public recitation of poetry. And I do that in my own family. Like when I have guests over, I will be the embarrassing and ridiculous father who's like, let's truck out a few of the children for a recitation for our guests.
Yeah.
And the kids are like, what? And the
My kids would kill me.
Yeah, the guests are like, what? But we do it and people love it. And we don't do it for hours. We do like 2 poems, right?
Yeah.
But just making it a part of their actual public life is kind of fun. And
Is it like a dramatic performance?
it's just a recitation, very simple, kind of like the reading I just gave, but from memory. They have to stand up. I mean, my colleague here, David Azarad, I had him over for dinner once when one of my sons was quite young, and he memorized Ogden Nash, rabbits. So this cute little blushing kid, just 5 years old. This is a verse about rabbits that does not mention their habits. And then he bowed, and he's like, that was amazing. So it's not, it doesn't have to be complicated or sort of like, and now the rhyme of the ancient mariner,
Yeah.
But that's one. But the other thing is in terms of teaching, like you were kind of saying it, the way we teach it is basically a kind of critical method.
I know.
Right?
It's
Here's
terrible.
the thing, let's murder to dissect.
Right.
But I think the more traditional way that I've been encouraging people to think more about in education, because I'm also on the advisory board for the Barney Charter School Initiative at Hillsdale and help with their curriculum and things like that. But one of the things to think about is imitatio, right? That used to be the way we teach poetry, is imitation. Like you do it. You make something, build, right? Like actually do it. And that's much more exciting. It's more fun. You have more purchase on it, right? Where you're like, okay, read this poem. Let's think about it, but let's think about it with the idea of you're going to do something like it, but that's your own. And I think the building of poetry and sort of actually thinking about it, almost like, let's study deck building, son. Let's look at 15 decks and learn them. Like, how about, let's look at some decks so we can build a deck in the back.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a totally different kind of aspectual approach to something. And I think it creates more joy. And I think it's also the way we had a poetic culture beforehand. So that's another big part of sort of flipping the script on the critical method.
Right. And do you think that we should read children's poetry to children, or we should just read them poetry?
Well, I think Mother Goose, like little rhymes, the Dally, that kind of stuff. I think it's salutary to do that kind of start a simple nursery rhymes, but also songs, right? Like songs are very helpful. Hymns from church, those things all give people the sense of rhyme and rhythm. And I think it's very good to do. But, there's some poetry, like if all poetry is an imitation of soul, right? The sort of like, I'm going to read Yeats to my kids, like, maybe some Yeats, but let's be very discerning, right? He's he's a complicated fellow that you might not want to leave with your kids after school, like, right? Like sort of the whole, like, I'm just going to read this, this poem from this complex author to my 7-year-old. I'm like, maybe you want to rethink that.
Yeah,
like,
probably not going to read Baudelaire to them.
Yeah, that's right. The fleur de mal for my 7-year-old. Not a good plan. Yeah, that's right.
It's a little intense. Okay, so you have a new book. Is this out now? Or
So I now have advanced copies like the one in your hand.
Okay.
But the final product, which has a slightly different glossed cover, will be out July 20th.
Okay, so that's exciting. So it's also tan books. So this is The Handsome Little Cygnet. And this is not poetry. This is just, let's talk about what this is.
Sure.
Right?
So it is a much simpler storybook for younger children, grades, K through 3, ages 3 through 8. But obviously, like I've said about the other book, it has an upper story for people who are older. But it's in what I call lightly metered prose, or what used to be called rhetorical prose.
Okay.
Think of the way like a Cicero or an Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address that has a certain cadence, but it breaks apart into something more mundane, but then it comes back to beauty and a certain rock and rhythm, and then it goes back into something. So it doesn't like hang on the ear too sweetly the way a poem would, but nevertheless it has a certain sort of gorgeous beauty that moves you. That used to be very common training in the liberal arts back in the old liberal arts education classical
Back when there
curriculum.
was liberal arts
Exactly.
education.
So I was like, you know what? I'm going to do. I've been teaching rhetoric a lot lately because of the grad school in government. I teach a required 1 credit in the art of rhetoric, and we read Cicero's De Oratore, where he talks about this practice that all the great statesmen used to do.
Right.
But I was like, this used to be a kind of way of communicating. So I wrote it in this almost. It's like it feels like poetry part of the time, but then you're like, no, it's not poetry. So I call it light. It doesn't have a name in English really, but I'm like lightly metered prose. So that's how it's written, and it has a kind of sing-song cadence. I even like sort of make something of repetition in a special way in the way the story is told that has a kind of rocking, childlike effect, a hypnotic effect that I think is very pretty. But it's a storybook that's a kind of riff on the Ugly Duckling story, but told in reverse. Instead of the Ugly Duckling, it's the handsome little cygnet. Like a baby swan is a cygnet. And instead of not knowing what you are and kind of moving towards discovery, this is the story of someone who basically has a fairly, clear but not mature view. And then it gets kind of shaken and confused. And then the little cygnet has to sort of rediscover who he is and what he's meant to be, which is, frankly, a very timely theme for the day.
Right.
Yeah, it's watercolor this time. John Foley did not do oils, so it doesn't have the sort of deep seriousness of the illustrations of the other one, but that one was about sadness and like overcoming sadness through joy and friendship. And this one's more, Little Water Bird. It's a kid's book, so it's more kind of brighter watercolor. It's a lighter touch for littler people.
It's still wonderful illustrations.
Oh yeah, they're gorgeous.
Really wonderful. And it's just like a really high quality book.
Yeah.
This isn't one of those books that's going to be falling apart after your third read.
Right.
It's not cheaply made. Why did you pick Central Park? It seems to be Central Park.
Yeah. For a bunch of reasons. A couple of them, I felt like New York needed a little pick-me-up. Right, with COVID.
Indeed.
Like
we all
there's
need
just
a little
kind of
pick-me-up.
Sort of a beatdown for Central Park and Manhattan and, sort of de Blasio.
Yeah.
So there's actually a seek and find in the back where you can learn about the wildlife of Central Park and the monuments.
Oh, that's really fun.
Yeah.
I didn't notice that.
And
yeah.
But there's also a few like stupid laughs like find an N95 mask, which is like cast aside amongst some garbage.
Right.
At the sort of gross part of the story.
Right.
But that's one. But the other one is that in terms of building what you are, right, like a coming of age book, which is, like in the algorithms, one of the algorithm markers for our book is, bird stories, coming of age, and parenting are actually 3 of the algorithmic keys for the book. And coming of age, part of that is like thinking about what you are and then artfully shaping that, right, to sort of enhance what you are. And so that nature and art together and seeing art as actually part of our nature, right, that we shape ourselves according to our nature into something. One of my predecessors at the Heights, Eddie Smith, a wonderful man, lives here in D.C. He looks like Frederick Douglass and has a booming voice. But he would say, male is a question of biology. A man is a question of virtue. Right? Sort of like to be male is that's just the nature of it. But to be a man, you have to artfully shape yourself into manhood.
Right.
So that's what I see a park as. Right? It's man using nature, leaves, grass, plants, ducks, but shaping it in a way that's useful to their city life.
Right.
And so I saw Central Park, which is the beating heart of this huge conventional city, and yet at the very heart of the whole island in Manhattan, but also the city itself, is this activity of taking what's natural and shaping and enhancing it to its greatest joy for, for fulfillment and human happiness.
Yes. Well, that is a subject matter near and dear to my heart since I do virtue ethics in the natural law tradition. But at any rate, I mean, I love your books. I think they're so just wonderfully crafted and just beautiful in every way that literary art can be beautiful. They are published by TAN, which is a Catholic publishing house, right?
Oh, yeah.
I'm really glad that we were able to do this.
Thank you.
And I'm such a big fan of Mr. Mehan's mildly amusing mythical mammals, and I'm so excited now to read your second book, and I'm really happy you're writing a third.
Thanks.
So, yeah, thanks for joining me.